United States is there, and Western countries are there. The threat of general conflict is reality, and because of that, it is a responsibility of all of us to change the situation and to put the things toward some kind of solution to avoid more and more losses in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Akhil. And you can be assured of the solidarity of the movement in Britain. But I've been watching the chat while you've been talking, and solidarity messages are coming in from across the world, all across Britain, but from across the world, from every continent. So thank you very much for your contribution. I know that there will be a whole number of questions, and I'm just going to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll do our best after Comrade has spoken to answer as much as we can. And I'm going to move straight now across to Comrade Ofer, and the floor is yours. Thank you very, very much, Comrade.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Hello there. I'm honored to participate, and I thank you very much for inviting me. And hi, Comrade, my friend Akhil. I would like to focus in the beginning on the events of the last 2 weeks or so, and thereafter to try to install them in a general picture or in a more wider perspective regarding the situation and what I think should be done, and or what, to be more precise, the international community should do. But first of all, I would like to shed some light on what has been going in the last 2 weeks or so. Everybody knows that the one who is responsible for igniting the fire that led to such bloodshed, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and within Israel. But there's no comparison because there was a massacre in Gaza. We know that in Gaza alone, about a third of the victims were children, and many others were civilians, whereas the formal statements of Israel was focusing, were focusing on what they call the terrorist victims, but which is, of course, quite hogwash, because those who suffered, as usual, are civilians, especially in Gaza. But the one who ignited the fire and in purpose, and this is something that everybody should be aware of. It's not a coincidence. It was not accidental. There was a causal relation between the things that Netanyahu did and the aftermath. And it was well planned by Netanyahu and his thugs. And so to start with, as I began to say, Netanyahu himself personally, and obviously the government of his, are responsible for igniting the fire that led to such a bloodshed and destruction in Gaza. Now, first of all, why and how? The why is quite simple. Netanyahu, and I said that a few days ago in an interview to the CNN, and there was a fuss afterwards in Israel because of that. Ever since I'm under assassination threats, but I won't shut up. The reason was that Netanyahu lost the mandate for forming a government. And because he is, and again, this is what I said in the interview with CNN, is a pyromaniac psychopath. He doesn't care a bit for his fellows, especially the Palestinians. He wants to stay in power because he knows that once he loses his rule, once he loses his seat as a prime minister, is quite clearly on the direct path to prison. And he's ready to do whatever he can, including igniting the whole region in order to stay out of prison. That's the why, that's the reason. Once the president of Israel transferred the mandate for forming a government from Netanyahu to Yair Lapid, a few days afterwards, the whole escalation began. It's not a coincidence. There is a causal relation. And so this is the why. Now, how? To make it very briefly, because we don't have the time to get into too many details, Netanyahu did before, when he already realized that he was going to lose the mandate, he began with a few activities and deeds that were clearly leading to this escalation. First of all, is putting defenses in Bab el Amud, in Damascus Gate. To those who are not familiar with this area, Damascus Gate, or in Arabic, Bab el Amud, is a very important place in the old occupied city of Jerusalem, in the Quds, where for many years it's common, especially for youngsters, for Palestinian youngsters, to sit and break the fast of Ramadan. And it was the first time that the police, ordered by Netanyahu, or to be more precise, by the Minister for Internal Security, Ohana, who is a puppet of Netanyahu's, to put the fences there, to locate fences on in the entrance to Damascus Gate, and to prevent those youngsters from sitting there. This was just a matter of teasing, a matter of showing those people who is the master and who is the slave, as it were. And we all know that colonialism and occupation are always about masters and slaves. So this is what this was one thing which began the escalation, gradually but firmly. Afterwards, of course, there was, or not afterwards, throughout many years now, there is that ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in the occupied East Jerusalem, in which the vast majority are Palestinian, indigenous people, themselves, by the way, descendants of Palestinian refugees who were deported from the west part of Jerusalem and from cities like Lud and Ramla. And they are the indigenous people there. And there is a system, and there is a policy of ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah, in which settlers, and the word settlers, all settlers are bad enough, of course, but there are grades, and those settlers are the worst because they belong to the most extreme racial fractions. And they are located there by force under the auspices of the state apparatus, especially the occupying forces. Now, if that's not enough, not too long before the escalation, the last escalation, bloody escalation began, the violence within the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah against Palestinians, as well, although not to the same extent, but as well as against demonstrators. For 12 years, there was a weekly demonstration of Jews, Palestinians, and others in Sheikh Jarrah against the ethnic cleansing and occupation. From time to time, the occupying forces used a lot of violence against demonstrators, let alone against the indigenous inhabitants of or residents of Sheikh Jarrah. But in the last few weeks or months, the violence became much more brutal than ever. And this is part of the escalation too. Another thing that was done by Netanyahu, and I say again, consciously and with purpose, is to allow the most racist fractions or political organizations in Israel, staffed by settlers of the worst kind, organizations that perhaps you know the names, Lehava or La Familia, I don't know if you're familiar with those specific names. Netanyahu allowed them to march in the city of Jerusalem, in the occupied east part as well as in the west part, and to actually tease and hit Palestinians as well as leftists, by the way, they were beaten too. But primarily Palestinians, again, specifically in Damascus Gate, but not only. And Netanyahu knew what was going to happen when he actually ordered, not only allowed, but ordered and encouraged those hate marches in Jerusalem, especially in the east occupied part of Jerusalem. So this was another stage in this escalation. And thereafter, there was the invasion of Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir, you know, I always say that if Netanyahu is the equivalent of Enoch Powell, so Ben Gvir is the equivalent of Oswald Mosley. And I guess that you know what I mean by those, by that. So Ben Gvir, to be very frank, is the clear-cut example of a Judeo-Nazi. And he was shamefully elected in the last elections into the Knesset. He's a member of the Knesset now. Now, he invaded and built a chamber, as it were. It was a tent, actually, in the most sensitive part of Sheikh Jarrah. He went there in purpose. And again, he ignited the fire, but as a proxy, because he's a proxy of Netanyahu's. And this was another stage. And of course, the peak of this escalation was the invasion of the occupying forces into the mosque of Al-Aqsa, including shooting there, shock grenades, and beating the prayers there, the praying people there in Al-Aqsa and the area, Haram al-Sharif as a whole. So this was very calculated. And it is disgraceful that in the international community, there are still leaders who say that the Hamas began the fire. Because the fire doesn't begin, historically and theoretically speaking, not only in this case. Fire or war or escalation normally doesn't begin with the shooting itself. But there are prior deeds or activities that lead, sometimes accidentally, sometimes consciously, and in purpose, to a war as such. It was, as I said, and I want to re-emphasize, it was calculated and consciously planned by Netanyahu to lead to this fire in order to prevent an alternative government to be formed, and in order, but by that way, to keep his rule. So this is something that the international community and everybody should be aware of. Now, this is how the escalation began, with the consequences that we are all aware of: the massive destruction in Gaza, the death toll in Gaza, and the victims as well as in Israel and the West Bank, and of course, what we are all aware of. Now, it is important to understand this specific escalation in the more general picture. My friend Akel said before, of course, I 100% agree with him, that the main issue is the occupation. The colonization and the occupation are the main and the basis, the roots of the current situation, including the escalation. Netanyahu tried with his thugs and companions and collaborators in his government to sell this product, as it were, that peace with the Emirates and Morocco and Sudan and the Bahrain and others, as if there was no need to reach any agreement with the Palestinians. I do not even say peace agreement, no, any kind of agreement. The conflict, as it were, because it's not a conflict, it is an occupation. Those are not the same. Because of that, I say the conflict, quote unquote. The conflict, Netanyahu and not only the extreme right in Israel, but also the so-called center. They believe that the conflict, again, quote unquote, may be managed. It doesn't have to be solved. And Netanyahu used shamefully, and the shame is on those countries, Bahrain, the Emirates, Morocco, that agreed to normalize the occupation, because by making a treaty with Israel, one cannot ignore that. They normalized the occupation and legitimized it. They can say whatever they like. They can try to tell us or to sell excuses from here, I don't know till where. This is totally poppycock, because there is no way to reach a stable and just peace in the region without ending the occupation of the Palestinian people and Palestinian land. So what the last escalation actually proves that to those who believed this crazy thought or view, because no people should or would agree to live under occupation, let alone such a brutal and ongoing occupation. The occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem has been going on in a week. It's going to be 54 years. I think the Palestinian people were too patient, because this occupation is becoming, on a daily basis, more brutal, more deadly, and more dangerous. First and foremost for the Palestinian people, of course, but also for the people in Israel and for the whole region, and I would say even beyond the region. It is, I would say, even a global issue for different reasons. And one of the reasons, probably the most important one, which Comrade Akel mentioned before, of course, is the imperialist issue. Because the imperialist powers, especially the United States, are interested in this conflict. It may be, and here there are internal disagreements and debates within the imperialist powers. It is not a substantial debate about yes or no. It is a debate about the so-called quantity. I mean that they, sometimes it depends who, but some of them would like to keep the occupation on a low flame, but they don't want to turn it off. If I use this metaphor, some others, like Trump, for instance, he didn't even care if the flame was bigger. But the substantial issue is the very occupation. Now, so if we want, and obviously we do, to end the bloodshed and the death toll of the Palestinians, which is on the rise, not only during the battles, like, if we can call it like this, or atrocities to be more precise, not only during what happened, 2 weeks ago, but throughout the occupation, because ethnic cleansing, shooting at Palestinians and killing them, putting fire into their fields, cutting their trees, sending dogs after cows and sheep of shepherds in the West Bank. All those things happen every day and every hour. But they are not, exposed internationally, by the way, not locally either. But only when there is a huge issue like happened in the last 2 weeks. But that doesn't mean that when such a fire, is lowered, so the occupation doesn't exist. No, it does exist. And sometimes even in a worse manner, because it is not known and it is not exposed enough. Since we want to end injustice in Palestine, the first thing that should be done is ending the occupation 100%. 100%. There's no half occupation. It's like half pregnancy, you know. There's nothing like that. Either there is an occupation and colonization, or there's none. And we are on the side that says none. No occupation. No occupation. Full stop. And this is something that we do need the support of the international community. The Palestinian people needs the international community intervention, and it needs the intervention, the just intervention, not the imperialist intervention that is interested in its own interests of profit, etc. Now, there's another thing I would like to say. I know that the time is short, so I'll try to finish in 1 minute or so. The occupation itself, I said that the last escalation should be analyzed and understood within the general framework of the occupation. But the general framework of the occupation must be understood in the more general framework of the Zionist enterprise. And because the Zionist enterprise is based on the idea of Jewish supremacy. And this Jewish supremacy was the basis of al-Nakba, but it is also the basis of the continuing policies of discrimination, racial discrimination within the state of Israel proper, not only in the Palestinian occupied territories of 1967. So the solution requires, as I said before, obviously ending the occupation, but also changing radically the policies of all governments in Israel in the sense of full and profound equality to all citizens in Israel, first and foremost, the 20% citizens or the Palestinian citizens. And that means equality, not only civic and political equality, and obviously we as Marxists, Leninists support the social and economic equality, but also national equality. The Palestinians are the indigenous people. They are the indigenous people within the state of Israel proper as well. And they deserve as a right to be regarded as a national protected minority and to enjoy national rights within the state of Israel, alongside the state of Palestine, of course, not instead of that. Last thing, with your permission, that it's very important for me to stress, and really last thing, the real issue here, the hostility is not between Palestinians and Jews. The hostility is between those who support Jewish supremacy, racism, and colonialism, and those who oppose those, and support democracy, equality, and justice. This is the real hostility. In that sense, I'm proud to belong to the side of Palestinians and democratic Jews who fight together for justice and see our enemy in the supremacists, not in the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Okay, Ofer, thank you so much for that. I want to stand firmly on the side that you have guessed so very, very clearly described to us. Thank you both, because I believe that with two contributions taken together, we have the background and an analysis of what is happening now, and an analysis of where the red lines are and how we must go forward. So I want to first of all thank you so much for that. While you've been speaking, we've had two questions come in, and I think perhaps while you've been speaking that they have in a way been partly answered, but I'm going to put them to you now. There is one shorter question and one quite long question which has several parts to it, and then bring you back and bring you in to say something about the matters that are raised. The first question is about the proposed one-state solution. And someone has said that they believe in a one-state solution and not a solution that is based, as they describe it, on ethnicity and supremacy. So that is something for you to comment on. The second question is coming at the same issue, I think, from a different perspective. And I'm going to read it, though it is quite long. And I should say, everyone, we are keeping the chat, so we will have everything that you have written recorded and can come back to it as well after the meeting too. But this question, of course, it is no coincidence that both Netanyahu and Hamas benefit from continued war. No, it is not equal blame, but we can't only look in one direction. On the 3rd of June 1967, there was no Palestine. It was occupied from 1948 by Transjordan and Egypt. Sadly, not everyone supports the two-state solution. Extremists in Israel, the Israeli government, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. That's got a question mark after it. We need to expose the very reactionary policies of Hamas et al., anti-gays, women, Christians, Jews, socialists. We need to reinforce the message that the two-state solution supports continued support for a secure state of Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state and an end to the occupation. Too often our language is interpreted by some as opposing the continued existence of the state of Israel itself, which plays into the hands of extremists and divides those who support ending the occupation. Good to see the big demos of Jews and Arabs in Tel Aviv today. So that is quite a lot there, but I think if you could come back on the issues that both those questions raise. Akhil, would you like to go first on that and then Oscar? Thank you.
I would like to talk a little bit about the idea of the one-state solution. One-state solution, as some good comrades imagining, is very, very good dream. To have democratic, secular, one state with equal rights between all citizens of the state. It is very, very good thing. But this is so far from the reality, because under the current conditions, one state solution is existing under occupation, racist, apartheid state, which is now Israel, which behave as an apartheid state against Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza, and also against its own citizens, as Comrade Ofer said before. And because of that, with this correlation of powers and this unbalance of powers, one state solution will not be the one which our comrades are imagining. Maybe it will be, but not now and not in the near future, maybe after. But now, the only viable solution is the two-state solution, because Netanyahu is claiming and saying that he supports the two-state solution, but he doesn't say where. Biden is talking about the two-state solution, but he also doesn't say where this two states will be. Where is the Palestinian state will be established? Netanyahu is saying that two-state solution have to be in West Bank between Palestinians and settlers. Some other extremists, and as you know, and as Comrade Ofer said, that now the government of Israel under Netanyahu's governance is an extra right government. It is the government of settlers. And Israeli political life is moving right, ultra-right and right. After every elections in Israel, the ultra-right is gaining power. And as Comrade Ofer said, that now there are some members of Knesset, as Benkbir and I don't know who else, are fascists. They are claiming to transfer Palestinians out of Israel. And because of that, in these conditions, one state solution only can be an apartheid state with Palestinians to be isolated in cantons, Palestinians inside Israel to be citizens second or third category, Palestinians in respect to be third or fourth category. And because of that, we don't support this solution. If it can be one secular, democratic, with equal rights for all citizens, it will be good. But in current conditions, unfortunately, no possibility to have this solution. And Israel and imperialist forces behind Israel supporting the continuation of occupation. As you heard today, Blinken is coming to Ramallah and to Tel Aviv after tomorrow. But why he is coming? He is not coming to discuss any solution for the issue. He is coming to secure the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Only that. He is discussing only this issue. They are not talking about starting any serious political process to solve the problem and to end the occupation and to give the Palestinians their rights. This is the policy of United States and all Western countries through the last 30 years from signing Oslo Agreement until now. Nothing serious was done to solve the problem. Only discussions, negotiations, and Israel is changing facts on the ground, making the possibility of the two-state solution equal zero. And because of that, we are aware that the two-state solution is losing ground. And it is not losing ground in favor of the one-state solution. It is losing ground for an apartheid state. This is the danger of future if international community is not doing something seriously. We are talking about Europe, United Europe, European Union. They are talking very, very good words to stop and to support and two-state solution without any serious step. Why no, except Sweden, no European country recognized Palestinian state within the borders of 67. Europe is only giving us words, but in the serious moment, they are following the policy of United States. Exactly as Washington wants, Europe is doing. They are talking now about the right of Israel of self-defense. Who is threatening Israel? Israel is the superpower in the Middle East, in the region, occupying Palestinian territories, killing Palestinians every day in checkpoints, in invading, cutting trees, invading and burning houses. And it is self-defense, as Britain, German, or some other European country is claiming that Israel has this right. This is an behavior unacceptable. If really these countries want to end this conflict, and we believe that they don't want because their interests is in the Middle East, from the beginning of the issue, from establishing Israel, is to serve the interests of imperialist countries in the Middle East. First for oil, now for gas, and to impose and to oppose Chinese policy, Russian policy, and something like that, because this is strategical region, politically, economically, and because of that, we don't believe that without changing real change of the policy of the international community, especially the countries in the Security Council, to force Israel to behave as under the law, not above the internal law, nothing will be done. And tomorrow is more dangerous than today if this policy is continuing. Thank you.
Comrade Akel, thank you very, very much for that. Just before I bring Comrade Offer in, there are a couple of questions, well, there are a lot of questions, but there are a couple of questions that have come in that he might want to cover in his reply. One is, what is the level of opposition to occupation among Jewish Israelis, among Jewish Israelis, and are younger Israelis rejecting the occupation? And the other one is, how can Hadash achieve a majority in the Knesset, and what would happen if that were achieved? So I know it's such a big area to
yeah,
cover.
I try to cover it all. First of all, thanks to my friend Raquel, I totally agree with him, so I will not repeat what he said because I totally agree. I would like just to add two things in that matter. First of all, about the 2 versus 1 state solution. That reminds me, that both Marx and Lenin, especially Lenin, dealt with questions of national self-determination quite a lot. Marx dealt with it vis-a-vis the Irish case. In the beginning, Marx believed that the proletariat of Ireland and the proletariat of England should join forces in a revolution against the capitalists in their own countries. But he changed his mind, and he realized afterwards and published about it that the key to the British Revolution, as it was called, goes through the self-determination and national liberation of the Irish people. So eventually what Marx wrote in regard to Ireland is that, first of all, the Irish people must be liberated from English imperialism, and by that to reduce, and I almost quoting Marx, to reduce the hostility between the Irish and the English peoples by national self-determination, and this is the key to the socialist revolution afterwards. Lenin said and wrote about it quite a lot, both theoretically and practically vis-a-vis the cases of the Ukraine and Finland, for instance. And he actually wrote in many places, many pamphlets and essays, Lenin wrote that one of the reasons that communists should support national self-determination, which is apparently, and I emphasize apparently, not a class issue. So Lenin said that communists should endorse national self-determination for many reasons. One, because it's part of the struggle against imperialism, because it is just, etc., because it's part of the struggle for equality, but also because it is the way to reduce national cleavages and hostilities, and by that to allow class struggle. That means that Lenin believed and wrote about it quite a lot, that one of the ways that imperialists use, that imperialists and capitalists, of course, cling to their power or pursue their power or strengthen their power is by divide and rule, by dividing the workers and the working class in along ethnic or national lines. It allows them to rule them. So national self-determination is one of the crucial ways to reduce the national hostilities and antagonisms, and by that to weaken the possibility of class struggle. And I think this is part of the issue, in addition to what Comrade Akel said, of course, not instead. Palestinian liberation, national self-determination in the occupied territories from 1967 is a part of reducing national and ethnic hostilities and antagonisms, which may allow much easily to pursue the class struggle. This is another reason why two-state solution is must be endorsed at the moment. But no one that I know, neither from my own Communist party nor from the PPP and others, I don't know anyone who ideologically opposes one state. I don't know anyone like that. I think that this is more a political issue rather than the ideological one. Believe me, I find my life would be much easier to live with my Palestinian comrades than with my Jewish hatreds. So I wish we could do that on the spot. It would be much more easier on me, and I'm sure I would be happier. But again, it is not a realistic thing at the moment, alas. Now, about the Hamas, if I remember the question or the remark, the Hamas is far from being my cup of tea, to say the least. Hamas is a reactionary organization. Is not a progressive, let alone a revolutionary organization or movement. We should not forget that actually the Hamas could not be established without the assistance of Israel. Israel has a lot of a great role in the establishment of Hamas in the end of the 80s. Sheikh Yassin met Rabin in his office in Tel Aviv. Israel wanted the Hamas as an alternative to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Israel thought that by strengthening a religious movement, it would reduce, not to say eliminate, the national aspirations of the Palestinian people, which of course was a total nonsense. And Israel is still, the government of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu wants Hamas to be strong. It's not a coincidence that Netanyahu for many years now dries up the Palestinian Authority, financially speaking, and at the same time transfers a lot of money from Qatar to Hamas. He wants a strong Hamas and weak national leadership, Palestinian national leadership, for two reasons. First, because he can use it as an excuse. There's nobody to negotiate with because the Hamas are too extreme. And another is because he wants to keep the division within the Palestinian people, between Hamas in Gaza and the National Authority in the West Bank. He wants to keep this division and cleavage in order to keep the occupation. So Hamas actually plays a reactionary role in this in those conditions. And of course, this is in addition to what the question or the remark mentioned before in regard to gender and the LGBT community, etc., etc. Now, as to the opposition in Israel, if we refer to the opposition within the parliament, within the Knesset, the opposition is very, very weak in two senses. First of all, the real left is very, very small because if we want to be precise, we are the only left. That's left. Because, of course, there is Meretz. I don't say that Meretz is, a right wing or absolutely not. It opposes the occupation, etc. But it is a Zionist party. I personally think that you cannot be a real leftist if you are a Zionist. That doesn't mean that there are no cooperations with Meretz, but Meretz is we can do many things with Meretz against the occupation, against the settlements, etc., etc. But real substantial left is only Hadash. we are 3 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. There are many reasons why we are so small. I won't get to that now because it requires a lot of time, but maybe in the future if you like. Another thing is that those who were supposed to pose an alternative to the extreme fascist right, even if I do not consider them as leftists, say the Labour Party, or even Yesh Atid, you know, the party of Lapids, of Yair Lapids. Of course, neither of them is leftist, and actually they're not even, at least Lapid doesn't even pretend to be. But they were supposed to pose an alternative partly as far as the occupation is concerned. One would expect them to oppose the occupation too. But one of the main victories of Netanyahu thus far is not only the number of seats that he and the extreme right has in the parliament, but also, and perhaps primarily, the change of the public discourse he created. He led those who were supposed to be an alternative to move further to the right because they were afraid to challenge not Netanyahu, the person, but the agenda of Netanyahu's. And they actually stopped challenging the agenda, the political platform, especially vis-a-vis the occupied territories and the Palestinian people. They stopped challenging him. And because of that, the alternative they were supposed to pose, and years ago, some of them posed, in fact, almost vanished. So the situation is grave, but that doesn't mean that I'm not optimistic. I am optimistic. It doesn't mean that tomorrow everything is going to be, ideal. No. But we continue, and I do believe that gradually we will succeed in changing the public discourse and removing the murderous occupation. But we do need an international community, and we do need to not to give up. It's not easy. As I said before, I personally under threats. Just 2 days ago, there was a demonstration in front of my house by people, supporters of the extreme right, who explicitly call for my assassination in the social network and even here in the street in front of my house. I was accused in treason by the chairperson of the Knesset last week. He accused me in treason. Treason in Israel, formally, the penalty for treason is death penalty. And the chairperson of the Knesset accused me publicly in the plenum in treason because I said at the CNN, as I mentioned before, that Netanyahu is responsible for igniting the fire. So the situation is bad, but we should never give up, because once we give up, that will be really the end. And we should never, and we shall never give up with all the threats, the violence, the risks that we take. We shall continue. Because of that, Jews and Palestinians together, by the way, always together, forever together. And because of that, I'm optimistic. I'm looking around and I see my comrades, and I see young comrades. I see our youth, Jews and Palestinians, and I say, yes, our struggle has a future. It has a good future, and we will eventually win over the fascists. It will take some time, but we will win. I just hope to be here to see it.
Comrades, thank you very, very much for those responses. And again, the aspects that you covered go together to make such a full response to those questions. Now, we are actually running out of time. We don't have time to go through more questions, which is a great pity because a lot are coming in. And I probably shouldn't do this, which is to tell you what questions are coming in and then say you can't answer them. But we're being asked some practical issues, how we can work with others, for example, how do we as communists interact with the axis of resistance groups, Hamas, Iran, Syria, etc., in the region that can keep the Western capital at bay, but can be reactionary? How do we interact with them in going forward? We're also being asked practical questions such as, how can civil structures be developed to displace the militarization of the area? You know, questions about how it can all happen. And what I'm going to say, because basically we can't continue the discussion this evening, is that this is just a first. We really must continue this dialogue, because it is so completely enlightening for our comrades and friends who have come to this meeting, and everybody is so interested. So this is the first of many occasions. But before we do end, I just want you, and I have to be very strict, a couple of minutes each to say very specifically what our movement in Britain must do to support you, and then I will come in with some closing remarks. So perhaps Ofer first, and we'll do it the other way around this time. Ofer, couple of minutes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. I don't need the 2 minutes because I think I already touched most of it. So I'll just say a few short words. I think it's very important that your organization will, first of all, as much as possible, put a pressure on your own government and on some other organizations, for instance, the trade unions and others. First of all, to be aware of what's going on here, because the media, which we all know who controls it, I mean class-based control, doesn't expose and doesn't really present reality as is. So perhaps you should do it as much as possible. I know that it's not easy. So first of all, to let people know, people must be aware of the truth and do not go astray after the lies of the official or established media. This is one thing. Secondly, as I said, to let progressive organizations like some trade unions and trade unionists and others to not only to know, but to try and put some pressure domestically, that is on your own government, and externally on organizations in Israel, for instance. I think that, for instance, the Histadrut, the biggest trade union in Israel, is very reactionary. I think that if you can pose or stress some pressure through unionists and unions in England on the Histadrut, this is one thing that may be very helpful. We didn't have the time to explain, but the situation of the working class, the Palestinian working class in the occupied territories, is much worse than ever, and of course than others, because they are not only exploited as a working class, but also persecuted as Palestinians and discriminated against as Palestinians. This combination of a double suppression must be well explained to the working class and the working class organizations in England as a first stage towards pressure. And the same everywhere. But I think this is the key.
Thank you very much. And Akel.
Thank you, Rees. I don't have too much things to add after my comrade offer, but I think that your solidarity, your movement, putting pressure on your government on two things. First of all, to stop arming Israel and to stop supporting Israeli policy and Israeli behavior in general, to behave as a country above all laws. This is on, and to recognize the Palestinian state and to put serious effort to solve the problem on the basis of the two-state solution. From other side, to have a pressure on Israel, knowing that boycotting Israel is very sensitive on the economical side. If we continue the supporting BDS, boycotting the products of settlements, it will be a very, very good step to force Israel to rethink. And because if Israeli occupation is continuing to be beneficial for Israel, they will not think to end it any time. And if we put this on the agenda to continue boycotting Israel economically and as BDS in sanctions and investments, I think that your solidarity will have a result. And we hope that your solidarity with our people, with the just people, because you know, Liz, that this is in benefit of the people in general, not only for Palestinian people, because this behavior and this policy is very dangerous for the future also of the citizens of Israel. This policy is dangerous for all of us, not only Palestinians, not only Israelis, not only Arabs, in general in the region. And this conflict can anytime be wider and be a global conflict. For the future of Israel, if anybody is aware about the future of Israel, Israel must be forced to change this behavior, because if not, nobody can imagine what is the result if the correlation of powers will change and Israel will be in a bad situation. And it will not be bad for Netanyahu or for any leader. It will be bad for the citizens of Israel, the simple people who are looking forward to live in peace and to develop their lives and their economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for that. And you have given us a real challenge. As you saw from the social media, there was a huge demonstration in London at the weekend. It's the biggest demonstration for Palestine that has ever taken place in Britain. The figures are towards 200,000 people there. Also demonstrations in other cities where people couldn't make it to London, in Manchester, in Coventry, in Newcastle. I shouldn't name them all because I will miss some out. So please, that shows that the people of Britain have not forgotten your cause and will never forget that cause, because your cause is our cause, as you have very, very ably explained. We were going to have this meeting before the most recent shameful events took place. And I think this meeting, as well as giving us a real insight into root causes, ways forward, the responsibilities of all of us, it has really showed what solidarity means. And we have a very big responsibility going forward. There is a lot of confusion still in the movement in Britain about things that we've discussed here tonight. We have a responsibility to work in the trade union and labour movement and in the peace movements and raise these issues and explain what is the situation, explain very carefully and clearly. And we also have a huge responsibility of taking on our own government. we would like, and I don't mean just the Communist Party, I mean the left in Britain. What a big responsibility we have. I would like, of course, to thank you again, but I would like you, please, to take our solidarity greetings to the People's Party of Palestine and to the Communist Party of Israel and to all the left and progressive and peace movements in the area. We are with you, and we really want to invite you again. And whatever we can do, it doesn't have to be something you have said this evening. If there is something that we can do, please to get in touch with us and let us know. One questioner did ask to be very, very clear about the position of the communist parties on the one state and two state solution. And I would like to draw everyone's attention to the message that is on SolidNet, which we will put in the chat now, and which was on the reverse side of the leaflet. 63 communist and workers' parties from across the world, from every continent, have signed that statement, and it makes very, very clear that our position is an end to the occupation, and it is a two-state solution with a Palestinian sovereign state. Absolutely, that is the position. If anyone would like to attend a meeting quite shortly that also talks about, its theme is End Colonial Occupation of Palestine, the organisation Liberation is inviting a panel of international speakers on the evening of the 8th of June, and you can find that details of that meeting on the Liberation website. So with that, I want to thank you once again. I'd like to thank everybody also who has come to this meeting and everybody who has helped to organise it and to make it possible. It is the first of many. We are with you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, comrades. Have a nice evening.
Yes, everybody have a nice evening.
Thank you
very
Bye
much.
bye. Bye, Akel, my friend.
Good night. Thank you.